The 2023 season saw yet another dominant start from Red Bull, which prompted some negative comments from the seven-time world champion in terms of how the FIA is handling the entire situation with the Austrian team and the rest of the grid. But while he feels like the governing body should intervene to save the sport's popularity and competition, his own team boss, Toto Wolff, went directly against Hamilton, slamming him for his comments and taking a completely different approach to this issue. Could there be something behind the divided narratives in Mercedes, and is this a solid basis for further tear aparts in the team? After an excruciating 2022 season, Mercedes struggled to get to grips with the W14 as well, resulting in the car not acting the way they wanted it to because they simply decided to continue with a design and philosophy that hasn't delivered the results everyone expected. The innovative yet not productive sidepod philosophy was finally ditched by the Silver Arrows, as they have now shifted the development path towards something more traditional and conventional, something they should have done after the first race in Bahrain last year. But after the current dominance of Red Bull, it seems like it's a bit too late now. And while the other teams are chasing performance in the right direction, Mercedes has yet to start from ground zero and build up the momentum to be competitive with Red Bull. Although this is very likely, we might have to wait a couple of more years until the Brackley-based squad catches up with Red Bull, which is why Hamilton made a comment on whether or not the FIA should intervene to make racing more interesting. Before we go into his comment and then how Wolff sees this entire situation, we want to remind you that the FIA did intervene to try and make racing more interesting, and it was mostly because Mercedes was a team that was constantly complaining about the negative effects of porpoising. This resulted in the FIA raising the floor edges for 15mm and the diffuser throats for 10mm, and during the 2022 season, more precisely the second half of it, the FIA brought the rules about prohibiting the flexing of the floor for more than 2mm, as Mercedes blamed Ferrari and Red Bull in terms of them finding a loophole that allows a car's floor to flex as much as 6mm. We've seen how this entire situation turned out, and that is why Hamilton's comments have likely made the experts in the sport and the global fans a little bit mad. When asked about whether or not he feels the sport is interesting for the fans at this point, the seven-time world champion went on to add, "I think it is something really negative. It's good that we're trying new things. It's important that we keep moving forward and evolving, because technology has evolved. It's unfortunate because we still have the same kind of gaps between the teams. I don't know what the solution is for the future, but I think we are going to have to keep adapting to these regulations. Otherwise, it could be the same as now for years, until 2026. It is true that racing hasn't been brought as close as the FIA would want it after introducing the new regulations, and it does feel like one dominated era was simply replaced with another, with 2021 being the only competitive season we've had in recent history. But if there is someone to blame for that, it's certainly the teams for not understanding how to properly build a car that would follow the principles of ground effect generation of downforce. Adrian Newey has been in the sport for long enough, but even Red Bull was surprised at how much the other teams struggled to keep up with them, which then again brings out the question, is the FIA the one that should react in a situation like this? Obviously, it's a touchy matter, and we're always going back to 2014 and 2015, when Mercedes deliberately hid performance just to avoid changes to the turbo-hybrid era regulations and to keep the dominance that they've managed to maintain for 8 consecutive seasons in the Constructors' Championship. It's always painful when you're on the losing side, but complaining about this will never bring out what you need in order to be competitive and fight for championships. Hamilton's time is nearing an end, and he knows more than anyone else that if Mercedes doesn't find a silver bullet, as Wolff explained it, his chances of winning the 8th championship are becoming thinner by the day. But what does his team boss have to say about this matter? Obviously, he doesn't feel like the FIA should intervene, and it seems like he is the one that's looking into this entire situation with a more rational approach, as he hailed the progress Red Bull has made and doesn't think the other teams should complain and seek help outside of the track. When talking about this matter, Wolff said, "Formula One is a meritocracy. The car is fast in all conditions. The driver is on top of his game. Even in the race, going off at a time but not retiring is a skill, and you can see that he pushed. All credit to them. We just need to do a better job. We just need to catch up, find intelligent solutions, hope that our development slope is steeper than theirs, and eventually fight for these championships again." Furthermore, Wolff went on to add that while the sport consists of multiple teams and therefore a multiple driver fight for the championship is something that the fans and the entire F1 world would love to witness, sometimes situations like this happen, and there's nothing that the other teams can do other than try and be better, as he continued. It's a sport, whether it's good for the show or not. Obviously, a strong fight between 10 drivers, or at least 2, is much better for all of us, but it's not happening. And that's why you have to just accept that and work to get back there. If we start putting in a balance of performance, we will ruin this sport. The best driver in the best car, spending the same amount of money, wins a championship, and if you break the rules in either, you should be heavily penalized. But only for that, and not for doing a good job. Obviously, Red Bull's budget cap breach has been the subject of recent talk as to whether or not it's worth breaching the budget cap and having around $7 million sitting on a side account extra, just in case you'll be spending less than 5% of the entire budget cap more. And from what the F1 world sees right now, Red Bull is unbothered by the penalty. Yes, we do have to wait until the second half of the season, where the benefits of the wind tunnels and the CFDs will be evident. But even without the budget cap penalty, it seems like Red Bull built a car that no other team could match. And to top that off, the existential crisis in Ferrari has been deepened more and more, resulting in the Austrian team being the sole carrier of the championships in the previous year. Mercedes isn't done in terms of upgrading their car, as now they have a couple of the most stubborn questions being answered. The issue was not in the sidepod design solely, but also in the floor of the car and the general concept of it. Monaco was not the proper race to see whether or not these issues have been addressed, and from Barcelona onwards, we'll see whether the W14 has made a step in the right direction, or they're yet for another data collecting season and fight for P4 and P5, like they did until now. The reality is that Formula One is a sport in which everything can change within a couple of months, but now with a budget cap that the FIA has enforced since 2021, the teams are not allowed to spend as much money as they want to make their cars competitive to an unbeatable level. This is something that almost ruined the sport from 2014 to 2020. But even with the budget cap, if Red Bull's dominance continues until the beginning of the 2026 season, it will be evident that the popularity will dip and the entire sport will face a huge backlash because it's always one-sided and monotonous. Therefore, while I personally do not agree with Hamilton's comments about the FIA intervening and changing the rules just because one team dominates, I do agree that this is bad for the sport's reputation, and for the new fans that the ever-growing sport has finally started to gather in places it had bad blood with, such as the USA. But if Hamilton needs to rant to anyone out there about what's currently going on in the sport, it's his team and his engineers, not the governing body, which is why Wolff's comments about putting your head down and putting in the necessary work are exactly what a team needs to do in order to beat the Austrian dominance.